So we studied in the previous session that the long run aggregate supply curve is a perfectly inelastic curve. That is, if the population is fully employed, you're exploiting all natural resources at a given technology level or at a given level in the economy, you cannot produce more regardless of the price. The price can go wherever, but you can't produce more because everybody is already doing the best they can. People are fully employed. You are exploiting all natural resources and the capital that you have. So no matter where the price goes, in the long run, aggregate supply cannot change because of price. Long run aggregate supply can move up or down depending on the factors that we studied. If your population improves, that is labor improves, technology improves, you find more minerals and natural resources in your country, then that will shift the long run aggregate supply. So just like in microeconomics, the equilibrium price and the quantity in an economy is determined by the interaction of the demand curve and the supply curve. So the supply curve is a perfectly inelastic curve. The demand curve also we studied, the combination of IS and LM curves, similar to the microeconomics demand curve, that is, as price reduces, demand increases. As price increases, demand reduces. So the demand curve is a downward sloping curve like in microeconomics. The supply curve is perfectly inelastic. The intersection of the two will give us the price level in the economy and the quantity. The quantity is the full potential GDP. This is also called the full employment GDP or the full potential GDP. Now, in the short run, however, we studied that the supply curve is an upward sloping curve. That is, in the short run, we can be above the full potential GDP or below the full potential GDP depending on the price level. So it's similar to the microeconomic supply curve that we studied. This is because in the short run, people can be overemployed. We can work over extra hours. We can work on weekends, or they may be unemployed. If people are overemployed, then temporarily our GDP can be higher than the full potential GDP. If people are unemployed, then the GDP will be lower than the full potential or the full employment GDP. The concepts that I'm going to teach next will come again when I teach inflation, and I will not repeat it then. So please understand them well now. It's the same concept that we'll study when we study demand pull inflation and cost push inflation. Concept is exactly the same. And now we're going to see what happens if the demand curve or the supply curve shifts to the left or the right. How does this equilibrium change in the economy? So again, we'll start with the economy in equilibrium. So this is the long run aggregate supply. This is the long run aggregate demand, or you can say just aggregate demand. Long run aggregate supply. The third curve that I'm drawing is the short run aggregate supply. To begin with, we will call them at t equal to 0 or as the beginning state. So this is where my economy was at equilibrium. Now let's assume that the government cuts interest rates, or rather the central bank cuts interest rates, or the central bank increases money supply. Increasing money supply will lower interest rates in the economy. Now, what that can potentially do is stimulate demand, because if I look at the CIGX model for demand, at a lower interest rate, corporates can invest more than at a higher. If money supply is more easily available, even consumers can borrow, and consumption demand can also increase at the same price. So at the same price level as before, if government follows an expansionary monetary policy, the demand curve will shift to the right, that is, at the same price, more will be demanded. Okay, this is a straight line, it's not a dotted line. So the green line is the new demand curve after a cut in interest rates. Question asked is that how will the equilibrium shift in the economy? So in the short run, the new equilibrium now moves to E1 from E0. That is, in the short run, if demand is higher, producers will produce more to capture this high demand or to capture this higher price that this higher demand will result into. That is, producers will see more demand for their goods. They will see that people are willing to pay a higher price. They're willing to pay a price P1 for the produce. So the producers will ask you to stay and work overtime. So they'll say, fine, we'll pay you another day. Can you come and work on Saturday as well? So you get an additional day's pay. It's the same pay. The hourly wage is the same, but I'm asking you to come on Saturday also and work. Will you be willing to do that? Probably yes. It's extra money. So you can give up a few weekends or just one Saturday and go and work extra and get the extra money. So in the short run, the economy will go up from the long run level of, let's say, Q0 to Q1. That is, we will be above the full potential GDP. People are overemployed. That is, we are working overtime. Now, let's assume nothing changes in the economy. The population doesn't change. The productivity doesn't change. The technology doesn't change. The only way you can continue to remain at this level is if people keep working overtime and keep producing more. You think in such a case, this is a sustainable option? Will you, for the rest of your life, be willing to work all Saturdays? Or forget the rest of your life, will you for a sustained period of time for the same price be working all Saturdays? Probably not. Or even if you work, you'll at least start to ask for a higher wage. If wages go up, if input costs go up, what happens to the supply curve? Remember the tables example. If the cost of plastic went up, if the cost of labor went up, what happens to the supply curve? Please recall, watch the video again on microeconomics if you've forgotten. The supply curve will shift to the left. So as input costs become more expensive, as wages become more expensive because people can't work at this level for the same price, they can't give up their Saturdays forever. They'll start asking for more money. They'll ask for higher wages. Hence, for the same price with a higher wage, the suppliers won't be able to supply as much. The supply curve will start shifting to the right until we reach a price level of P2. So until we reach this price level, the short run supply curve will keep moving to the left. That is, wages will keep going up. Wages will keep going up. Producers will start to price their products higher because wages are going up. Supply curve will shift to the left until we reach a price level of P2 and a production level back of Q0, that is back of the full potential GDP. So as supply curve is shifting to the left means what? Some suppliers are going out of production. At the same price, earlier Q1 was the supply. Now at the same price, the supply is much lower. The supply is to the tune of Q2. That is, as wages go up at the same price level, less will be supplied because some marginal suppliers will go out of business. Some people were barely making profits, and as wages went up, they will go out of production, so supply will come down. For the same price, if earlier so much could be supplied, now less can be supplied. That is the meaning of the supply curve shifting to the left. Supply curve will keep shifting to the left. That is, people will start getting unemployed, or they will start getting less overemployed. That is, they will stop working their Saturdays. Producers will cut production until we get back to a level of Q naught. So what we see is that what happened in the short run was that we were over producing, that the GDP went up because of a stimulatory monetary policy, and the result will be the same for anything that shifts the demand curve to the right. Increasing expectations, fiscal policy, monetary policy, anything short term that shifts the demand curve to the right would have a similar impact. However, please note that it cannot increase long run GDP until your technology or your labor or one of the factors we discussed improve. In the long run, wages will increase, prices will go up, and the employee or the economy will come back to their full potential GDP, however at a higher price point than before. This is also called demand pull inflation. We will study in the next chapter. I'm not going to draw this graph again. Remember, this is called demand pull inflation. The higher demand is causing inflation in the economy, or is causing price levels to go up from P0 to P2. Now, similar theory, in case, please try and draw the graph yourself. What would happen if the central bank increased interest rates? There would be deflation. If central bank if aggregate demand shift to the left instead of the right. So again, this is where we were. We studied what happens when demand shifts to the right. If aggregate demand shift to the left, that is, the central bank increased interest rates, for instance. So businesses couldn't invest as much, even consumers can't borrow, so housing demand slows down a little bit. You don't want a mortgage, because the mortgage rates are higher. So again, please note that temporarily economy will go below full potential GDP. The new equilibrium will be here. But what will happen in the long run? People are unemployed. If we are below full potential GDP, means some people are unemployed, because if everyone was employed, we would be at the full potential. If everyone was employed and producing what we can produce. So as demand goes down, temporarily some businesses may shut down because pricing has become lower, and at this lower price those businesses cannot operate. So temporarily the economy goes below full potential GDP. But what will happen? As people are unemployed, they will be willing to work at a lower salary. So wages in the economy will start correcting. Once wages start correcting, input costs start going down, supply curve will start shifting to the right. At the same price, suppliers can now supply more because wages have gone down or input costs have gone down, until we reach back at the level of Q0. So at this level, now again the pricing has come down from P0 to P2, and the employee or the GDP is back to full employment GDP or full potential GDP. Price level has gone down, wages have corrected, and we are still producing what or we are back to full employment, and we are producing the real amount that we can. So this will be in a response to the exact opposite, that is to a decrease in aggregate demand. Okay, this generally doesn't happen, but this is a very common phenomena in today's world. That is, central banks printing more money, central banks stimulating the economy, interest rates going down, demand going up, but then in the long run, it is only causing inflation because technology is stagnant. We cannot increase the long run GDP by changing of price levels or by short term measures. Of course, in the short run, it does help. It does help to go above full potential GDP. Or if you are below full potential GDP, in a situation like this, for instance, if now some stimulation, let's say demand came down because of bad expectations, so there was a terrorist attack somewhere and people were suddenly not in a very good mood, or people's expectations were not very good and demand was coming down. In such a case, monetary stimulus may have gotten demand back up to counter the impact of that negative shift in the demand curve because of bad expectations. So in the short run, these factors can move the GDP, but in the long run, technology has to improve, productivity has to improve if GDP has to improve. Now, we studied demand pull inflation. That is when demand goes up and wages also go up, hence prices go up, economy comes back to the full potential GDP. Now, let's see what's going to happen if the supply curve shifts to the left. So, again, we'll start with the red graph first. Let's assume this was our existing equilibrium. So, this is the long run aggregate supply. This is the short run aggregate supply. This is the aggregate demand curve. Now, there is a cyclone or a hurricane, for instance, and a lot of factories, oil plants, oil fields get destroyed or damaged because of this natural disaster. Because of this natural disaster, what is the most likely effect that is going to happen? Will it be on the supply curve or the demand curve? The supply curve will shift to the left at the existing price level. If earlier Q naught, that is the full potential GDP that was being supplied, now less can be supplied because some production has become unprofitable, or at the same price some capacities are just no longer there. So again, at the same price, because of this hurricane or the natural disaster, demand is still there. People still want the goods, people still want to travel, they still need the oil, but there is just no supply. So supply curve has shifted to the right. Now, in such a case, again, what happens to the short run equilibrium? It will move from the level of E0 to E1. Equilibrium is where demand meets supply. So price has gone up and the GDP is below the full potential GDP because some supply is just not there. So even the products are lower, so people will be willing to pay a higher price, but still only so much can be produced. So economy temporarily moves to below full potential GDP, this time not because of demand issues, because of supply shocks, because of supply going out of production or supply curve shifting to the left. Generally what we have seen, that governments, central banks, people in general will realize that this is a short-term phenomena, that we will recuperate from these losses from the natural disaster and supply will soon come back up. However, in the short run, we may not want the people to be unemployed or underemployed for a long term or for a very long period. So what one theory says is that anyways, if economy is below full potential GDP, wages will correct. That is, these people who are unemployed because of the natural disaster will be willing to work at a lower price, such that supply curve will again start shifting to the right lower wages, and the economy will come back up to equilibrium. That is, we'll come back up to Q naught and P naught. But we've seen that generally this takes a very long time for wages to correct, and in such instances of supply shifting to the left because of these short-term factors, generally monetary stimulus is also provided. So if there's a natural disaster or something like this, then central banks will cut rates, governments will cut taxes, governments will increase spending such that the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right. So in response to the natural disaster, central banks cut rates. If central banks cut rates, then aggregate demand will shift to the right. Idea is to get back to full potential GDP. Please note, government wants everybody employed. That is one of the reasons why we elect a government, or one of the key policy agendas of any government anywhere in the world, that it wants to ensure full employment for its people. And employment means anyone who wants to work should get a job. If you don't want to work, that's all right. But anyone who wants to work should find a job suitable to his capabilities. So to ensure that, governments will provide monetary stimulus. So aggregate demand curve moves from shifts to the right, as we discussed earlier, such that the economy comes back up to the full potential GDP. However, the price level has now moved from P0 to P2. So again, we are back at the same level of production. We are back at the long run aggregate supply, but the price has moved from P0 to P2. This is referred to as demand pull, was the earlier one. This is called supply push. So again, price levels have gone up and we are back to the full potential GDP. This time because supply has gone down, or because of a supply shock. So please note, in general, we've seen, or what the theory of economics says, is that in the short run we can go up or below, but in the long run wages will adjust such that we are back to the full potential GDP. Now please note, you can shift both at the same time also. So there are many graphs given in the slides. A decrease in aggregate demand. Please note, we start with 0 when you to read these graphs. Please note, the original situation was of 0, and then either the demand curve shifts or the supply curve shifts. Adjustment in wages will bring us back to the full potential GDP, just like we discussed. An increase in aggregate demand, similarly, you can go through. Stagflation is what I just is the last graph I explained. So the supply curve moves up, governments stimulate so that the demand curve moves up. We're still at the same GDP level. The real GDP or real production in the economy is the same. However, the price level has moved up. Stagflation is basically inflation without any growth. So inflation but no growth. Now the problem here is that if you keep stimulating more, then price will again keep going up. So you have to be careful about how much monetary stimulus you want to provide, because the more you provide, the price level will also keep moving up. And we'll study in the coming sessions the harmful effects of inflation. So too much inflation is bad for any economy, and we'll see the reasons why it is a problem. Again, a decrease in input prices will do what? Will shift the supply curve to the right. So again, you can see what is going to happen. So in the short run, we will move ahead, but in the long run, prices will again move up because wages will move up. So we'll come back to equilibrium. So in the short run, an increase in aggregate demand will increase the GDP. A decrease in aggregate demand will decrease the GDP. An increase in aggregate supply will again increase the GDP. A decrease in aggregate supply will decrease the GDP, and it will have the opposite effect on unemployment. Of course, if aggregate demand and aggregate supply both change at the same time, then we will have to see, is the supply shock more or is the demand shock more, to make a final judgment on what is actually going to happen. So if supply goes up, demand, if both effects are in the same direction, then so if aggregate demand and supply both increase, then GDP will increase, but will the price level change will depend on whether supply increases more or the demand increases more. If supply increases more, then price levels will come down. If demand increases more than the supply, then price levels will go up. Okay, don't worry too much about this slide. You can think of it logically, but just note that depending on which effect has a higher impact, a supply increase will have a negative impact on prices. A demand increase will have a positive impact in prices. So depending on which one has a higher magnitude will be the resultant price or the final price in the economy. Now, just winding up on long run aggregate supply and understanding sustainable economic growth. Please note that for long run aggregate supply to grow, either our population has to increase, that is, our labor supply needs to go up. It is generally defined as the people over the age of 16 who are either working or are available for work but currently unemployed. So this is the labor supply, that is the supply available to be employed. We'll study more about this in the coming slides when we study employment. So it definitely depends on population, it depends on the immigration into your country, the labor supply, and it also depends on the labor force participation rate. That is, how many of the people over the age of 16 actually want to work. So if you want to study, then you may be over 16 but you are not a part of the labor supply because you're still studying or you still want to study. So labor force participation is people who are available for work, that is, who want to work. So for the GDP to grow, labor supply needs to increase. Human capital needs to improve, that is, the skill of the people needs to improve. So the education and skill level is just as important a determinant as the size of the labor force. So skilled and well educated people are seen to be more productive and better able to take advantage of the advances in technology. So investment in human capital, we have seen across the world, leads to greater economic growth. And generally, more developed countries and countries that have seen faster growth in the GDP have had better human capital, that is, a more skilled population. Machinery is equally important. So high investments, that is, high machinery, high plant, high capex in a country increases the stock of physical capital. More physical capital, that is, more machinery, better will be the productivity of this labor. If the labor is working on a good physical capital, he'll be able to produce more than if he's working on with his bare hands or with his own abilities. So physical capital is important. More physical capital also means more GDP growth. Very important determinant, especially in today's world, is the technology, because we are already hitting limits of skill development, we are hitting limits of physical capital. So for GDPs in the world to grow now, especially for the developed world, we need the technology to improve. So technology improvement generally helps both labor productivity, or it massively helps labor productivity and economic growth. We explained this concept last in the previous session, so please watch the video if you've forgotten that how technology improvement will help the GDP growth. And finally, we also studied last time natural resources, that is, if we have more minerals, more oil, more land, then again they can help us produce more, or the economic output can increase. So one way of looking at the GDP is the aggregate hours worked, that is the labor force, which is a function of the employed labor force, multiplied by the productivity of the labor. So the first factor that we studied amongst these 5 increases the aggregate hours worked. All the other factors, be it physical capital, be it technology, be it natural resources, be it human capital, increase the productivity of this labor. The first factor increases the aggregate hours, second factor increases the productivity. So if the GDP needs to grow, either the labor force needs to grow or the productivity of that labor force needs to grow. Now, the sustainable rate of economic growth is the rate of increase in the economy's productive capacity, or the potential GDP. So sustainable economic growth is the rate at which the long run GDP can grow, or the sustainable GDP can grow, because any of these 5 factors that we discussed earlier. So it can be estimated by estimating the growth rate of labor productivity and the growth rate of labor force. Now, a production function describes the relationship between the GDP, or between the output and the inputs. So the inputs in our case is the labor and the capital stock. So land, natural resources, physical capital, we are all clubbing it together into capital. So when I say capital here, it includes land, it includes the machinery, it includes the minerals, raw materials, etc. So we say that whatever output we are producing is because of labor and land, or rather labor and capital, not land. So the GDP, or the output, is a function of the labor and capital employed multiplied by the total factor productivity. Total factor productivity is, you can say, a measure of the technological prowess of a country. So this is the increase in GDP, or this is the productivity that cannot be explained by increases in labor and capital. And we studied last time that if technology improves, then for the same labor and the same capital, the GDP can improve. So A is the total factor productivity, a measure of the technology, or a measure of the technological prowess at a given state in an economy. So total factor productivity is closely related to the technological advances. Now, what we've seen is that labor and capital both have diminishing marginal productivity. For both labor as well as capital. We studied this in microeconomics also, and to an extent the concept applies similarly in macroeconomics, or at a country level. That is, if I only keep increasing labor, if I just keep increasing labor by 10% every year, will the GDP increase by 10%? No, because the labor needs capital to work on. If there are no natural resources, you can have as high a labor, they won't be able to produce anything because there is no natural resource. If only capital grows, if capital grows by 10%, will GDP grow by 10%? No, because to work the capital we need labor. If both labor as well as capital grow by 10%, will the GDP grow by 10%? Yes. So labor as well as capital have diminishing marginal productivity, that is, increasing just one of them will not increase the GDP to the same extent, or will increase GDP to a lower extent than just increasing, or than the extent of increase of just one item. So the growth in GDP can be summarized as the growth in technology, that is the growth in A, plus the growth in labor multiplied by the weight of labor in the economy, that is a measure of the productivity of labor or the diminishing. So WL will be less than 1. WC into the growth in capital, again WC will be less than 1. That is, if we only grow capital, GDP will not grow as much, it will grow to a lesser extent. WL plus WC will be equal to 1. That is, growing both labor as well as capital by 10% will increase the GDP by 10%. So WL and WC are labor's percentage share in the national income and capital's percentage share of the capital income. Similarly, we can divide it and by the number of people, and again we can say growth in per capita potential GDP will be the growth in technology plus WC times the growth in capital to labor ratio. Never mind this formula, it can easily be derived from here. So just remember that the growth in potential GDP is the growth in technology plus the weight of labor into growth in the growth in labor plus the weight of capital into the growth in capital. WL plus WC, that is weight of labor plus weight of capital, is equal to 1. Each of them represent their respective percentage shares in the total national income or the total GDP. So that was about aggregate output and long run GDP growth, a slightly elongated review. What you need to understand is clearly the distinction between long run and the short run. Know that long run will only change because of changes in long run factors, and that short run factors will get diminished or will get neutralized in the long run if any of these long run factors doesn't change. Long run aggregate supply is perfectly inelastic. That is, it is linked. It is not like microeconomics. In the coming reviews, we'll talk more about how GDP grows. There are periods of high growth, there are periods of low growth, how inflation is calculated and measured, how unemployment is calculated and measured, and the effects of each of these parameters. So that was about aggregate output, and we'll continue the discussion on business cycles in the next session.